This conversation with Paul Hillegonds, former Speaker of the State House of Representatives, is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History, a project of the Michigan Political History Society. I'm Bill Ballinger, and I'm here with former Speaker Paul Hillegonds. And I'd like to ask you, Mr. Speaker, when did the Hillegonds family, and for that matter, your mother's family, get to Holland, Michigan?
Well, my parents met at Hope College. My dad was a minister, and after he completed seminary, we moved to New York State, Chatham, New York, and Rochester, and only returned to Holland in 1960 when I was in 6th grade. And I completed high school in Holland and went off to the University of Michigan after that. So Holland was always home when I was growing up.
Were both your parents from the Holland area originally, even before Hope College?
No, my dad was from the south side of Chicago, and my mom was from Hackensack, New Jersey.
Wow. Well, how did they get together between Chicago and Hackensack?
Only Hope College brought them together.
I see.
My dad
Okay.
returned to complete his education after the war, and my mom had enrolled at Hope College. She was part of the Dutch Reformed community in Hackensack.
Well, now that's the thing that's always confusing to a lot of people. Is it the Dutch Reformed? Is it the Reformed Church? I mean, explain the difference.
Well, the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church in America both started with the Dutch immigration to the country, mainly around the New Jersey, New York area, and then a movement to West Michigan. And somewhere along the line, the two denominations became separate, and now they're talking about coming back together again, as a matter of fact.
Well, now, were you the only child in your family? You have any brothers and sisters?
I have one brother who is 19 months younger than I. We always were pretty close in growing up together, and we remain close.
Was there any politics in the background of either one of your families? Like, did your brother take an interest in politics? How about your father, mother, their parents, or whatever?
Well, my father was always interested in politics. I think his experience in the war not only led him to the ministry, but he became very intensely interested in politics. I remember once he dragged me out of the basement where I was practicing with a rock band I was in to watch the Winston Churchill funeral, and he talked about the importance of Winston Churchill during the World War II era. And it wasn't just an interest that he had in history, it was very much a feeling that politics was important. It probably was one reason I decided to run for president of the junior high school in Holland, and started becoming engaged in politics through student council.
So you were kind of interested in politics at an early age yourself, at least student council politics. And because of your father's interest, he never really acted on it in terms of being a candidate himself. He just took a very active interest in following politics.
He did, and I think probably I was a product of the John F. Kennedy era, which was inspiring and engaging for young people. My dad, after he served 5 years in a church in Holland, became chaplain at Hope College during the Vietnam era. So while he never ran for office, he was on a college campus during a very intense political era. I subsequently attended the University of Michigan, and couldn't help but be interested, engaged in politics, given all that was happening on campus at the time.
Were you active in campus politics at the University of Michigan at all?
On the margins, I attended, for example, the Chicago Convention as a protester. I was
This was which convention?
the 1968 convention,
Okay.
when Eugene McCarthy.
The Democratic convention.
The Democratic
Okay.
convention, yes, that was my first convention.
All right.
And I was there for Eugene McCarthy in Grant Park. That was my first convention experience.
So you consider yourself a Democrat at that point?
I was more interested in what was going on in the Democratic Party at the time, yes. I can't say I was strongly involved in either party. What helped to define the direction I suppose I took was I became an intern in the first Washington internship program that the U of M sponsored, and ended up working in Marvin Esch's office between my junior and senior years.
Congressman from Ann Arbor, Republican.
Republican.
So that converted you to become a Republican?
You know, again, I don't think I had a strong allegiance, and Marvin Esch was a very moderate Republican. I liked his politics, and that led to a job after I graduated from the U of M in a Republican office, mainly because Marvin Esch's staff helped me land a job in Phil Ruppy's office.
So you graduated from the University of Michigan in
1971.
In 71.
Yes.
And so you immediately went to Phil Ruppy's office in Washington? He was a Republican congressman from the Upper Peninsula, a moderate Republican like Marv Esch.
Yes.
And so you worked in that office, what, about 3 years?
I actually worked there 7.5 years.
Whoa.
I started out as his legislative assistant. 3 years into the job, the administrative assistant, now called chief of staff there, left his position, and Phil asked me to run his office. And so I essentially served as his chief of staff for about 4.5 years.
Well, so you were there during the latter stages of the Nixon administration through Watergate?
I was.
And the Ford administration?
Yes,
And
a couple of
into
years
the
of
Jimmy Carter administration. What was your impression of Washington at that time? And by the way, why didn't you stay in Washington? I don't think you've ever returned.
I never have. I loved working on Capitol Hill, and I respected greatly both Marvin Esch and Phil Ruppy. They were pragmatic, very focused on policy, and represented very different districts. The Upper Peninsula and Ann Arbor are very different, but very independent districts in a way. They really had to pay attention to both sides of the aisle and the independent electorate, and that probably shaped some of their own interests. I really felt after a while that being on a congressional staff indefinitely made you more of an observer of the process as opposed to being directly involved, unless you were on committee staff helping to write legislation. And so when I received a call from the then chair of the Ottawa County Republican Party, Jim Dressel, asking me if I would consider running in an open seat at the same time he had decided to run for office just north of the district that I ran in, I was intrigued, and I went home to explore the idea. Holland still had many old friends of the family, and they encouraged me to run. I knew it would be a crowded primary, but I decided I'm going to take a leave of absence from the Washington staff. Phil was very supportive of that, and I spent basically 6 months going door to door, which was the only way I could have won that seat, given that I had been at the U of M for 4 years and then away in Washington for another 7.5.
Well, lots of times people who work on congressional staffs in Washington, or let's say for a congressman but work in a district office, they build up a real relationship with the district. But here you've been absent, as you say, all that time. That must have been tough, coming back and like immersing yourself in an area where you kind of felt, maybe I'm a little out of touch here. I haven't been here.
It was, but through the work I had done for Phil, and you will recall that I was going to have to make a change away from Phil's staff if I hadn't returned home, because he was prepared to run for the Senate, until Bob Griffin decided
That's right.
to run. But in the process of his exploring the Senate race, I became well acquainted with the Republican Party in Michigan, including Keith Hartwell, who used to work for Marvesh, was then executive director of the party.
Right.
And Keith really helped shepherd me around Lansing. And while the party had to stay neutral in my primary, they certainly provided a lot of good advice and I think gave a lot of comfort to local Republicans who didn't know me that well.
You said when you were in Washington, you kind of felt like even though you were running the congressman's office, you were more like an observer, but you really developed a passion, fire in the belly, so to speak, to actually be a legislator yourself. And you decided, this is something I really want to do. What was it that really made you feel like, you know, it's not enough to just be around an elected legislator and help him. I want to actually be a legislator?
Well, I spent a lot of time observing both Marvesh and Phil Ruppe in their committee work, and really did have a passion for policy making as opposed to the campaigns. I ended up running a couple of Phil's campaigns, would take a leave and go back to the Upper Peninsula, but my passion was around policy. And it's interesting, when I spent a little time in Lansing, when Phil was exploring the Senate race, I had a gut feeling that I would enjoy Lansing much more than Washington because you were closer to home. The policy making in a way was less academic and more real for people. I felt it was of a scale where you really could make a difference on policy making. So it was that attraction to Lansing, I think, which caused me to think about running for office, and I never really had much interest in returning to Washington to do policy making there.
Well, now, your big race was winning the Republican primary. You said you had 5 opponents?
5 opponents.
And once you won that, I have got to say to anybody watching this, it's no surprise that that was a pretty heavily Republican district, so you didn't have too much trouble in November.
Incredibly, that first race, I had 5 opponents in the primary and no opponent in the general.
No opponent in the general, Mike. We
Open
can't get any easier than that. So, okay, you're elected, and let me just ask you about those first 8 years you spent in the State House, 4 two-year terms. Your district changed slightly under reapportionment beginning in 1982, but not much. I think the basis of it was really Allegan County with little pieces of attached counties, either Ottawa or Van Buren or maybe Barrie. But you were in the minority in the State House. That's one thing that you shared with Mr. Ruppe and Mr. Esch in Washington. They were in the minority. What was it like serving at that time in the minority in the State House in Lansing? And they had been in the minority at that point since 1968. So you might have begun to feel like, hey, are we ever going to get the majority back?
Actually, if I recall the numbers, and you probably know better than I, but that first election in 1978, Bill Milliken won the state comfortably, as I recall. Interestingly, in Allegan County, the base of my district, he only carried the county with 53% of the vote.
Wow.
And that was about the strength of the pro-life movement, and there was a prison controversy. He wanted to locate a prison in Saugatuck.
Oh, okay.
But at the same time, he was winning comfortably. The Democrats, I believe, had a 70-40 margin in the House.
I remember that.
And
one of their biggest majorities ever.
So when I first entered, it was important that we have leadership that was focused on policy. And Bill Bryant, who was our minority leader, really did encourage us not just to oppose the majority, but to come up with our own ideas about policies that should be enacted. And so he assigned 3, what we were called the 3 Musketeers, but Jim Dressel, and Paul Henry from Grand Rapids and myself to a workers' compensation reform task force.
The West Michigan Mafia.
The West Michigan Mafia.